Welcome to Corpstruction, the podcast of the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Tulsa District's flood control mission extends up to Council Grove, Kansas, and encompasses the southern half of the Sunflower State. Many of those reservoirs also provide water supply to industry and Kansans throughout the Sunflower State. Today on Corpstruction, I'm joined by Nathan Westrup and Richard Rockel, and we're discussing how they go about identifying ways to ensure water supply availability for Kansans and industry in the state of Kansas. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
So to get started, what is the Kansas Water Office's mission?
The Kansas Water Office serves as the water planning agency, policy, planning, coordination for water resources in Kansas. Our mission is to ensure that the water supply needs of Kansans for all purposes are sufficient. And that includes, surface water supply, groundwater supply, but, we're focused on policy and planning. We're also a wholesale water utility. And in that, and using reservoir storage, we have contracted for 14 USACE reservoirs for water supply storage. And I think that I'm going to introduce a little bit of history. In 1958, there was, the Water Supply Act, which allowed for incorporation of water supply storage in the USA's flood control reservoirs. And of course, that act also required that there was a local non-federal sponsor for the costs associated with including the water supply storage. And around that time, in fact, I think the first time I saw it was there's a resolution by the Kansas legislature in 1961 establishing kind of that statement of interest that, yes, the state of Kansas wants you to include water supply in these, in these reservoirs as you build them. Some predate the 1958, but the bulk of the reservoirs were built after that. And with that in mind, there was the genesis of, and we used to be the Kansas Water Resources Board. We made a change at some point to the Kansas Water Office. It was still the water planning agency. And the genesis of the water marketing and contracting for storage had a couple phases. But to start with, we did contract for storage in quite a few reservoirs, and had something called, which in a program that still exists today, the water marketing program. So the state, or and I should go back. So there was a choice. Just back a little bit. Sorry. So with the opportunity for water supply storage, like before we started this, when we were talking offline, the city of El Dorado, that's a El Dorado reservoir. There was an agreement. They stepped up and they contracted for the water supply storage out of El Dorado. And that's just a direct core, contract with that city. And they make all their determination how much they want from that reservoir, and they're not sharing it with anyone, although they may sell it. But that's a direct contract. There was some piecemeal water utilities that did contract for storage both in the Kansas City district and Tulsa district, but not enough entities, cities, water suppliers were kind of stepping up to make that investment, because it's quite a commitment. There's a purchase price and ongoing operations and maintenance. So and the reservoirs, they cost different amount. Each reservoir is
it's based on the cost of the structure at the time of construction. So, an older structure is going to have cheaper water typically.
Right. But maybe higher O&M costs.
Right.
But anyway, we pay our proportionate share there. So the state stepped up and said, we're going to create policy and pass legislation called the State Water Plan Storage Act. And that's going to be managed by the Kansas Water Office. So at that time, we started, and this started in the 70s where we established, that contractual relationship. And then I think another important part of the story to describe how we have our framework set up now is that in the early 80s, it was recognized the Corps of Engineers, I'll just tell it more of a story format. The Corps of Engineers said, okay, you've contracted for some storage, but we're also releasing water from these reservoirs for downstream water quality purposes, to keep the river flowing, for aesthetic purposes, for water quality, for aquatic life, etc. And your water users in your state, there's people irrigating or pumping for recreation. They're taking that water that's supposed to stay in the river. So we got together, both the Kansas City District, Tulsa District, the state of Kansas, and entered into a memorandum of understanding, which both brokered a deal for us creating a framework and developing water rights, Kansas, so state law water rights, to allow for the storage of both water supply and water quality in federal reservoirs. And that is the authority of the director of the water office. It's a separate authority from the normal water right in Kansas, which is under the Appropriations Act. And I'm going to let Richard talk about water rights in Kansas next.
So within Kansas, all water within the state, it's dedicated to the use of the people of the state. However, it's subject to the control and regulation of the state. And so that regulation and control, that will be handled through our state level water rights process. So that would be where all of your non-domestic uses of water, that can range from recreational, industrial, municipal, whatever your usage of water would be. And those are handled, those are a real property right within the sense of Kansas law. And that's what authorizes those other uses of water. So for the Kansas Water Office, the water that we are contracting to our cities, our municipalities, irrigation groups, those are all handled through the water rights that us at the Kansas Water Office actually hold.
So how do you all go about managing the water supply issue?
Yeah. So the rest of the story after 1985, we developed these water reservation rights. And so both for water supply and water quality, because it was stored under a Kansas water quality right that we hold for the Corps-owned portion of the storage. Once it's released, it can be protected from diversion downstream. And the Division of Water Resources, the regulatory agency, can shut down, uses of water downstream because they only have the right to natural flows. And if we're releasing water from a reservoir, it is a release from storage, and an act, you have to have an agreement in place, like a water purchase contract, or be a member of a district, which we manage. So again, we built a lot of framework on this. I talked about one thing, the water marketing program, and we sell water under the water marketing program from USA's reservoirs at a price per 1,000 gallons. In 2022, it's 45.4 cents per 1,000 gallons. And what we use that revenue for is to pay our costs to the Corps, our principal and interest for the original purchase, and for the operations and maintenance, and some for administration and enforcement. But the real, next level step for operating the systems. So in the Tulsa district, we have that the water office plays a large role in is the Cottonwood Neosho Basin with Marion, Council Grove, and John Redmond. There was legislation passed for the creation of a district called the Assurance District, and that is every municipal or industrial water right holder that's in a position to receive releases from a federal reservoir within the boundaries that are defined by the water office. If they vote to form a district, if a majority votes to form a district, the district is formed, and then all water right holders of municipal and industrial use it's a mandatory membership. And so, having everyone in for the water uses most critical to water, the water supply in the reservoirs, makes it a little bit easier. So we develop with a regulatory agency, DWR, the water office, and the assurance district, and we develop something called an operations agreement. And so we establish target flows along the system, and rules about how we're going to operate reservoirs in times of drought, and then that matches up with our arrangement with the Corps of Engineers and how we've established the mode of. In fact, Tulsa District for the most part relies on the water office to determine what the water quality needs or the flow needs are through the system, because back in it all started in '85, right, that we came up with that agreement. And because we did, we were offered the second round of us purchasing storage space. We were sold a portion of storage, so that second round at a basement price, bargain price. It was as built costs,
right?
Which really allowed us to just fully develop this system. So we have 3 assurance districts in the state: one in the Kansas City district, one in the Meridazine, so in the Kansas Basin and Kansas City district, and the Meridazine Basin, and then in the Cottonwood Neosho Basin. We've tried on occasion in the Verdigris Basin, but we haven't had the water right holders vote for the formation. So in the Verdigris Basin, we operate under memorandum of understanding with the Corps that we operate Toronto, Fall River, and Elk City as a system to maintain targets throughout, and also provide municipal industrial water demands. And then, similar to the operations agreement with an assurance district, we have something, and it's just, again, a memorandum of agreement with the Division of Water Resources and how we're going to manage and administer water rights. So we have a lot of structure. The water officer, our role is to look now and in 40 years, 50 years, what do we foresee? We have this tight-knit relationship with all of our customers, all the water users, those that are relying on the reservoirs, and it's our responsibility to ensure we have sufficient yield in those reservoirs to make sure we meet projected demands. And in the Tulsa district, more it's more so that the demands are stable or even decreasing. Sometimes we have to evaluate, an industry coming in would be an increase, but there's not a lot of growth. Up in the Kansas City district, we have a lot more demand growth. But what we do face is reservoir sedimentation. So if you look at it as a yield, a supply demand chart, supply is decreasing over time. And even if our demand isn't going up, there's a crossover, and not having a sufficient supply is unacceptable. So we have to find a way. The reservoirs are critical to the water supply needs of those folks living in that Tulsa district in Kansas.
Yeah, and that southeastern portion of Kansas, and I guess the southern half of Kansas overall, but right. Especially that southeastern, because that's where the vast majority of those lakes, pretty much all of them are. What are you looking at in terms of addressing that? I mean, you've done the John Redmond dredging,
yes,
and recovered some storage from that. What other avenues are available, or are you considering, or what's being looked at?
Yeah. So go ahead, Richard.
Oh yeah. So this is where, we're working with the Kansas City district to kind of, some of the Corps of Engineers staff. So John Shelley from the KC district that's been looking at different forms of active sediment management. And then we've had some folks, Roland Hotchkiss, who's a professor for sediment management. He spoke at some of our government or conferences that we have had, and looking at how can we start to implement some other pilot projects or some trial bases, or demonstrate if there is some other ways to do some active sediment management, and how we can kind of get that to align with maybe some of the changing federal priorities and trying to extend the lifetimes of these reservoirs. As Nate said, even in these regions where our baseline demands may not be rapidly growing, or we may not foresee rapid growth, just the increase or the sedimentation process is reducing our yields that we'll be able to use out of those reservoirs. And then we are getting on some carry-on water quality impacts, whether that's from the harmful algae blooms, bringing in some nutrients with those sediments, and then impacts on our water suppliers there. Also, those yields for the reservoirs outside of just the municipal and our human demands, those are used, as Nate referenced, to keep the flows going through those systems. And several of these systems, we do have some threatened species that we need to maintain some flows so that they are not negatively impacted. And also allow us to better prepare for some variation, just for the variable Kansas climate that we see. And just if we have more frequent drought events, being able to have and maintain those reservoir storage benefits, that helps us prolong through those events.
Is that where you get into the question about hydrosuction?
Right. Yeah. So hydrosuction would be another one of these.
And can you explain how that works?
Yeah, so I'm certainly not an expert like John Shelley would be on this topic, but from the reports that they've been shown from him, is it would basically be looking to attach to the existing water supply tubes that currently run through John Redmond Reservoir a certain length of ductile iron with then a flexible hose on the end of that would then have some form of an intake head. And this would basically be using a suction process through the dam to try to begin to bypass sediment out of the reservoir. So
that when we release water,
right,
it brings some of that with it.
Right. The idea would be could you develop a process where you could have a controlled discharge of some level of sediment to offset what is coming in, with the reservoirs having a very high trapping efficiency, some 95, 98% of sediment being trapped. How is there a way that we could maybe begin to release some sediment? We probably won't always be able to match what the incoming is, but if we could pass some of that and not have negative downstream implications, that could be a means to start developing some more tools and techniques to prolong the lifetimes of the reservoirs. With the water injection dredge process, we're hopeful to demonstrate at Tuttle Creek Reservoir, maybe you could combine a couple of these active sediment strategies to prolong the lifetimes of these reservoirs.
So does that require is that a physics thing where it happens just when the release goes, or would it require some type of additional energy in the form of you have to suction it out with a generator type or motor engine?
Well, I would say that's part of the initial sort of look that's being done here with the water injection project. We actually have had some looking at that done with the ERDC group of the Corps of Engineers to try to determine, maybe what could be fluidized, and I believe looking at the possibilities of inducing a density current. And then also with the hydrosuction technique, that's something that's still being looked at, is how can you induce that, and do you need to add extra energy there, or what is that process within a federal reservoir?
Right. Yeah, because the reservoirs, when we built them, typically they had about a 50-year lifespan, and they're gonna. I mean, that was the original idea. Is the engineers who designed them, they thought, well, it'll take 50 years to silt in. That really hasn't happened.
Actually, yeah, I always, and it's always an interesting concept. They developed a sediment pool. Mm-hmm. So a planned sediment pool. So 50 mm-hmm. years, a certain amount of storage would be filled in with sediment. Mm-hmm. But I believe the only purpose for that was for, and some of the reservoirs have 100-year sediment pools.
Yeah.
People, I think, mischaracterize that as lifespan,
right?
And it's just the planned sedimentation. This is what's projected to happen. So I like to move away from this is critical infrastructure that we should make sustainable, and I don't like to mix those two. But originally I think the purpose of that, like the 50 years in a 50-year period.
Yeah.
It was the economic analysis.
Yeah.
The benefits. You had to have a positive economic benefit within a life, a lifespan. And so if we have at least this, and it was just a way to define that economic period, I believe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, my hope someday is that everyone at the Corps will be saying things like this. Yes, there is a federal interest in extending the useful life of this infrastructure, and I mean, and I think a little bit of that has changed. I mean, there's been years past that people go, well, they're designed to fill with sediment. I don't know. We don't have any interest. It's as long as the flood control pool is still working, it doesn't really matter, unless it gets in the way of operating gates or something. But my goal is I hope someday everyone has the same feeling, like we're not going to be able to build reservoirs again, or it's it's very unlikely. It's hard to accomplish something like that. And especially the reservoirs that exist, they're in the right places. And let's take care of this infrastructure. I think the Water Office, you mentioned the traditional dredging project at John Redmond. We only gained about 1,860 acre feet of storage capacity. And that was at a cost of $20 million. I think the biggest, that wasn't a difference maker in having a sufficient yield for the nuclear power plant and others downstream. The pool rise, we had a 2-foot pool rise there that we gained about 17,000 acre feet. And that's got us through a period of time. but we're right there again with sediment in the reservoir that we're probably going to have to incorporate Marion Reservoir and John Redmond Reservoir and the use of both to ensure that we can meet our obligations to the nuclear power plant, Wolf Creek. So, I'd prefer to leave water in the upper end and use just John Redmond. But we need to find a way to, start passing some sediment. I think the best argument for passing sediment through a reservoir is it's going to happen eventually. Mm-hmm. We'll have to realize that it's going to pass its annual sediment. The trapping efficiency is going to decrease when the multipurpose or the conservation pool is full of sediment. So why not do it in more of a controlled way and do it in a way that might even have some environmental benefits? Because a lot of aquatic life, native aquatic life relies on turbid water. Some not clear, but anyway. Have anything to add, Richard?
Oh yeah, just as I gave you this handout, this map that shows like this 2070 projections, and some of those are coming from our collaboration with the Kansas City District on a watershed study there, and then some are just coming from our historical data of the other reservoirs. But one thing to keep a note that has kind of come out of the Kansas River study is, there's definitely a drastic reduction in the conservation pool storage, or what would be available for maintaining stream flow and quality and municipal and other needs. But even within that, there was a pretty significant reduction of the flood pool capacity when we look 50 years out with the current operation, or with the current trajectory of sedimentation. So it is, how can we maybe develop some tools that we can prolong these benefits of the reservoirs into the future, instead of we hit, a filling of a sediment pool, or we hit some pre-imagined deadline, and, we need to keep these benefits not only for our systems that we've developed, but how do we keep these going into the future? There's a significant amount of Kansas, as you referenced, in that southeast portion of the state, but in other areas of the state, large areas that they don't have significant other sources of water. So if we want to keep water supply and the irrigation and the recreational uses going, we need to figure out how we can maybe come up with some tools to work together and keep prolonging the reservoir benefits into the future.
Is water pipelining something you all are considering, or is that something that you're looking into at all? Like moving it from one reservoir to another location via pipeline versus?
Well, we have evaluated that possibility. One look was at running a pipeline from Melbourne Reservoir. So
I drove by that on the way up here.
Yeah. That's in the Kansas City District in the Meridazine Basin. But it was determined there's too high a cost. And Melbourne has a very, very small watershed. The yield, the amount of yield that you could move from that reservoir down to, let's say, the cooling lake of Wolf Creek, it just wouldn't be worth the cost. And that's something else we work on constantly, and we've created is, refining operations. So there's more you can gain in system operations. Back many years ago, we only worked with spreadsheet models with the reservoirs. What's the yield? What's a simple yield? If you withdraw water supply from the reservoir under conditions of a drought through a period of time, what's the maximum you can withdraw on a continual basis. But we've been investing in I guess, in the amount of time I've been at the water office, 15 years, and it even predates me some. We did develop we started developing a system models. I mean, the Corps has their system models. Really, it's geared more toward flood operations, and so ours is geared more toward low flow operations and allows for in reservoir the account management. So there's lots of different colors of water in a reservoir, and then in the river, once you let it go, there's water quality storage, there's assurance storage, there's water marketing storage, there's and so inflows to the reservoir, they go in proportionately into the percentage of storage space dedicated to a certain use. And then when it's released, it's subtracted from that account. And so the water office also maintains, ongoing, accounting of the reservoir storage. But I actually wanted to jump back a little bit to your previous question, because I thought of something I think we left out. You were asking what we're doing.
Yeah.
You mentioned the dredging and stuff, and the watershed work should be mentioned. Stream bank stabilization, best management practices, sediment conservation within the watershed. There's been a significant effort toward that, and lots of money spent on it. I mean, both for nutrient and sediment concerns, and that work needs to continue. But what we've found is that accounts for a very small portion of the sediment in the reservoirs. The projects that you can do within the watershed and the scale of it could take a whole lot of money. and then you get an extreme event and it washes out all the projects you did. So I'd just like to throw in there that I do think, and just stress the idea that I do think it is important that we do deliberate and direct, in reservoir sediment management, and come up with those plans. And it would be really nice if the Corps and the Water Office and the state were working together to solve that problem.
With the stream bank stabilization?
No, with
just the silting?
Doing the reservoir sediment management, because no matter how much work you do in the watershed, it's those extreme events that the work you do in the watershed, it can't control Mother Nature's desire to pick up the sediment and deliver it to the reservoir.
So what would that look like in the in-reservoir sediment management?
Yeah, that would be, we did the traditional dredging.
Yeah.
That's one way. That's the least cost-effective way.
Yeah, that was the first, I believe that was the first one of its.
Yes.
First one of its.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best. The best thing I think that accomplished was establishing that a state, if we find the funding and have want to do something like that, we can do it.
Yeah.
We got over that hurdle. It was kind of a proof of concept that the state could come in and take care of the storage space we've contracted for. Try to maintain that, try to extend the useful life of it. But, like Richard was just talking about, hydrosuction, water injection dredging, maybe there's another innovative solution out there that, maybe it's a mixture of traditional, but disposing of it downstream of the reservoir. There's examples of that, but I think the only way for us to reach a sustainable reservoir management is with that passing sediment through the reservoirs. Yeah.
And you said you were doing some work with Engineering Research Development Center, or you're looking at what they're doing down with the one in Vicksburg?
Yeah, that's what Richard was talking about, where he mentioned Tuttle Creek Creek Reservoir. It's on the Big Blue up. You can see it. It used to be our largest reservoir. If you look at the on the map, it was the largest reservoir.
Okay.
And you can look at it now. It's half full of sediment, and in 2070. There's hardly any water left. and that's kind of John Redmond is kind of in that same about a percentage loss. And so that's an extremely important reservoir for us to maintain. That's the workhorse of maintaining flows of the Kansas River. Mm-hmm. And so that's also a good candidate with low sluice gates, gates at the bottom of the reservoir, to be able to pass sediment out, a solution out. And that water injection dredging apparatus would be, kind of a barge with pumps and some pipes going down, pushing sediment along, creating a density current and hoping that with normal releases or releases under the right conditions, maybe we need enough for it to be diluted downstream to pass that sediment through. Now, the advantage of doing something like that at Tuttle Creek is that there are no reservoirs downstream. There's some low-head dams, but there's no reservoirs downstream of Tuttle Creek. In the Tulsa district, downstream of Redmond, there's some more reservoirs.
Right.
But if we all start looking at all our reservoirs and try to make them and developing, some innovative solutions, we'll work them all together. All right, that's the hope and dream, I guess.
That might take federal legislation to do that. You're gonna have to have an appropriation unless it's some kind of a partnership, I would imagine. Where the state says, "Hey, we'd like this, and we're willing to have this done."
Partnership would be great. We don't want to carry the whole load. But like the John Redmond dredging, the amount of capacity we did reclaim there, the 1,860 acre feet, that's shared equally between Corps-owned storage and state-owned storage. Mm-hmm. So we invested in some of the Corps-owned storage too.
Yeah. What? How you said you had 14 USACE lakes or was it 14 USACE reservoirs in Kansas
that we have water supply contracts
between Tulsa and Kansas? Okay. Mm-hmm. Is there a lake you don't have a water supply contract with?
Well, we don't have a water supply contract at Fall River.
Okay. What about Big Hill?
We do at Big Hill. Fall River, we also, and we have. Remember, I talked about the memorandum of agreement we have with the Tulsa District for the Verdigris Basin operations. That provided us the authority to operate both Fall River and Toronto reservoirs without obtaining a water supply contract. We ended up inheriting, and this is probably getting too much into the weeds, we inherited a very small water supply contract at Toronto. But essentially, Fall River and Toronto were built under a different authorization that allowed for the use of conservation storage for maintaining stream flow, municipal and water supply, downstream municipal and water supply demands without the state's investment in a water storage purchase. All the others, so in that 14, Toronto's included because we have a very small contract there that we inherited from the city of Toronto they couldn't afford the O&M payments anymore. So we took it over for them. But the other 14, there's one USACE reservoir, Wilson, and that's in the Kansas City district, that there's no water supply contracts. Otherwise, all of them have, water supply contract or an agreement in place that we operate for.
Would modern day Kansas be able to meet its water supply needs without reservoirs, without the man-made ones?
Not during drought. Would you agree?
How do you outside of that, where do you draw your water?
Well, yeah, so the river basins in Kansas, I just preface all this in that each one is a highly variable system and it has a high variation between surface water and groundwater supply capabilities. But just could be generally stated, yeah, in times of drought or prolonged low flow conditions, yeah, we're going to need the reservoirs to not only maintain those flows to keep the in-stream purposes met, so that would be your environmental and biological, but to offset those demands that have been created for the human needs. And especially if we're in periods of low flow and we have large users that are wanting to turn on, we need to be making reservoir releases to either meet those demands, keep the rivers flowing. Even we've heard of even when demands were less, I believe Nate had a story of where there was talk of people hauling water for prolonged periods during low flow conditions, where some of our river systems would just, go to disconnected pools. So if we were to try to throw the demands of today and some of our low flow drought events, it'd be a challenge. Some of our systems, they have really well-defined, real extensive alluvial groundwater supplies. But some of them, there's, especially Southeast Kansas, there's not a whole lot of other supplies of water that could be used for those cities for low flow or drought periods.
Yeah, the Verdigris Basin is blessed with a lot of precipitation.
Yeah.
But they are also hard hit during drought. That dries up pretty quick. There's not that, bolstered up alluvium that can continue to keep flows going there. That story that Richard was talking about, I dug, I found a newspaper from the 1950s. That's our drought of record, 52 through 57 in that. And that's what we planned for ensuring that we can make it through what we define as the 2% chance drought. We can supply, our projected demands. So anyway, it was a newspaper article from the city of Independence down there by Elk City Reservoir, prior to the reservoir. And in the 50s, there was a period of time that they went 6 months without flow. And they were, this article was talking about how far they're having to go. There's a riffle pool, sequencing along the Verdigris River, and they were having to go upstream and downstream and searching for pools, going farther and farther to haul water for the city. So it was pretty interesting.
So even back before, modern water laws were established in the state, people would just, I guess, west of a certain point would dig a well, right? Or they would drill a well or whatever. And that was where a lot of families got their water back in, or they would be near the river. I take it. Is that?
Yeah.
But on the east side, they in the southeastern part of the state specifically, they would use the Verdigris or the.
Yeah. I'd say,
or the Neosho.
Really thought about it. Yeah, the Neosho, the cottonwood.
Yeah.
The cottonwood, I mean, it's a a springy river. There's lots of springs along. It's gaining, and back in the 50s, I think that was the only portion of the Cottonwood Neosho, basin that was, producing base flows. The upper Neosho dries up pretty quick, but yeah, back in the early days before they were built, and maybe before we had the any sort of framework, it was just people's efforts to create some storage capacity on a small scale. And quite often it was using, the channel, the low head dams, and where you knew they were going to get refilled. So
utilization of some low head dams to keep the pump sites for the municipalities, kind of keep some water there, or there was kind of more of a historical utilization of smaller local reservoirs that, as the federal reservoirs and the contracting has come on, there's been movement away from that, and then contracting to be supplied by the larger reservoirs that have higher drought resiliency benefits.
On the Cottonwood River, well, there's the courthouse area where you can walk across the bridge. There's a little low water dam there, right? Or there used to be. Maybe it was destroyed. I don't know. But do you know what I'm talking about? They have that beautiful courthouse. Cottonwood.
Strong City, Cottonwood Falls.
I think so. Maybe.
Strong City. I'm not.
It's on the Cotton. There's a bridge you can walk across, and you get little small, beautiful, idyllic looking downtown area.
I have seen pictures of that. I know
it's gorgeous. It's absolutely beautiful. I didn't know if that was typically what they were doing, because I actually think there's a Corps of Engineers. I think there's a Corps of Engineers logo on it or insignia on it, but I can't find record of it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's old relics of the past you see here and there, like at Altoona, this is a tiny little town on the upper Verdigris. They have they built a pretty tall low head dam. I mean, that's a high low. But they had mills on there. They used it for water supply. They used it for power generation, even if it was just mechanical. There's a lot of old structures that are still being used.
So when there's I guess, do you have it on a schedule typically for allocations to be released, or do you just make a phone call to the area office or the water office there at the Corps and say, hey, the H&H section, you say, hey, they need this much water?
Yeah, it's an active management. Okay. We're continually monitoring, and we make a determination about not only what's needed for consumptive water demand for a municipality, but also what's needed for environmental purposes. And we have a very close relationship with the water management folks in Tulsa. And I have zero complaints. For 15 years, I've worked with this water management, the engineer
hydraulics and hydrology.
Yeah, right. And they've been just awesome to work with. It's a perfect example of teamwork. They keep us informed. We keep them informed. We take some responsibility sometimes for making the decisions, and then they have a very difficult job during the flood times. That's, I'm sure, high stress time. And then in drought times, it becomes more of our responsibility to stress out. But they're always there to help manage and work within the construct and the authorities we have. But
have you been to visit them and see their operation and how they?
Yeah, I have. It's been quite a few years. I need to go down for another visit. But yeah, I've there's some people that I worked with. There's been a little bit of turnover.
Yeah.
But each time it turns over, I'm always pleased with the replacements, and so they've had a pretty good, even with a turnover, it's a conveyor belt of good employees going through there. So
I'm sure they'll be happy to hear that. Dr. Williams will really appreciate hearing that. You kind of mentioned blue-green algae or harmful algae blooms, and how do those blooms impact you all? I mean, with us, it impacts recreation, and we see it on the recreation side, and no one likes that when they want to go swim or go to the lake or whatever. But how does it impact how you guys have to operate?
Well, I would say so. We hear the recreational impacts and from those stakeholders, but then impacting the municipal customers, and in there, it's how it impacts their treatment process. So some of our municipalities, they've changed their treatment process, which can involve a pretty significant capital cost. Some they handle it through just addition of chemicals, and by that method, but both of them are increasing their base treatment and operational costs. Um, and for some of these cities, specifically, one we're working through right now, they're fairly small population, so significant increases of those treatment costs or capital expenditure, when you're applying that to a city that only has 500 or 1,000 people, that can get pretty significant for them as far as what it takes to keep their city services operating in that sense.
So it can be treated, or it can be, fixed, but there's a cost to it. But I'd also like, in the Kansas City district, I mean, we're talking more and more about, you know, the Milford Reservoir, and it's kind of the biggest problem with algae blooms, blue green algae, and then there's it leads to a lot of monitoring for the toxins downstream. But I'd say, I mean, that's less of a problem on a river, although it's still a concern, and there's a lot of monitoring that's going on. But it's more of a problem for the water suppliers that have a direct withdrawal from the reservoir. Yeah.
So what is you all's for KWO? What is your strategy or vision that you're really hoping to accomplish over the next decade or two?
Ooh. Well, so maybe to flow into some of the quality things. So that would be where some of the basin work would happen, is how do we get some long-term reductions in some sediment inflow, and then the nutrient load that is also coming in with those sediments. So, and then that would be causing our recreational and our harmful algal bloom impacts there. And then, how can we try to maintain those reservoir yields into the future? So, try to do basin work to keep that out. And then how can we do some work in the reservoir or downstream to figure out how we can maybe get some of that sediment out, or how to manage some of that sediment long term. Just as we're looking to contract, we issue these fairly long-term contracts with the cities that we supply and support. So how can we keep the functions of the reservoir and the quality of the water within the reservoir just usable for those next 10, 20 years? And I'd say some of that is written throughout our Kansas water plan that we develop, and then with the interactions of our regional groups.
Are you adding additional water supply customers annually, or does it tend to stay the same?
Oh, it comes in spurts. In the Tulsa district, we haven't for a while, but we are having to adapt in different management and using different reservoirs for our big customers. In the Kansas City district, it's more growth than adding, and so
the water, the municipalities need more water. Because you're getting that growth out of Kansas City itself into areas like Olathe. Is that how you pronounce it? Olathe?
Yes.
Yeah. You get that growth into Olathe, and that's actually sort of a double-edged sword for you guys, because on the good side, your state's growing, your region is growing, so there's more revenue coming in, and but then you have to on the contrary side meet all that demand, right?
Right. And we have to invest, to continue to invest to make sure we have enough water supply. That's pretty important for attracting industry as well, and that's probably the biggest growth potential we might have in the Tulsa district. Is bringing more industry in. We're looking at some additional interest or industry in the Verdigris Basin and in the Cottonwood Neosho in recent years. And another way we're growing in our dependence on the federal reservoirs that we control is, like we talked about, like the old infrastructure, the old city lakes. And, one of the big challenges is, the water treatment standards and the amount of expense that goes into operating a small treatment plant and keeping that up to date is with like shrinking towns. So even if like your county is losing population, but you have to keep supplying what remaining population is there through a more centralized, or a single source. And that happened like down in the Verdigris Basin, Fredonia, at Fredonia, a public wholesale water supply district formed there to start supplying all these little towns. And so there's more concentrated demand from the Fall River. So they serve like Buffalo, who used to get their water out of an old clay pit where they mined clay and made bricks. Have you ever seen Buffalo brick with it stamped on there?
No, I don't think I have.
Oh, okay. They're you see them around once in a while.
Okay.
But yeah, so like Buffalo and Altoona and stuff, they don't have the personnel, they don't have the ability to treat the water. We still have
that maintenance facility or that water treatment facility, which costs a certain amount to run and maintain, and you have to figure out how to supply a smaller number of people from further away or a larger.
So now, the expense has kind of gone into, distribution systems and centralizing, putting all the, getting enough customers so they can take care of a treatment plant, but they have a little bit more expense in distribution. But so anyway, there's a lot of things like that to deal with. But that's the water office's job, to make sure we aren't headed off a cliff. We need to have a long-term vision and ensure that we have sufficient water supply.
Does that get sort of nerve-wracking? Does it keep you up at night at all? I mean, because you know what the changing demographics are. Every decade there's going to be a census taken, and you're probably going to grow, and yet the amount of rain may or may not increase, and the amount of storage that you have available may or may not increase. In fact, and based on what you're experiencing, is technically decreasing based on siltation.
Yeah.
So And I think that's an important topic, because I know, especially us in the federal government, we tend to think of things in terms of, even though things are always changing, we even think of things in a static sense. This was made for this, and this is how it's going to be. And unless the legislation changes it, the mission's going to maintain what the mission is, right? You got to have that authorization, and then you've got to have the appropriation. So it takes two acts. But things are going to change, and the way we've traditionally looked at things is going to have to change. And if we're going to use the same systems that we've already got in place, we're going to have to, update and change. How do you all look at that in terms of, meeting demand? Because you have your customers and you have your mission, and we have multiple missions, right. One of which is helping you meet that mission. But how do you make that happen?
Well, I'll give a go at that one. So, one thing that we're doing right now this legislative session, and Nate's put in a whole bunch of work on this, is finishing off and paying down all that debt that we do have within Kansas that is tied to our water storage contracts. So looking at how can we, number one, take care of that debt and save on some interest that long term, not having that expense will reduce some costs for Kansans and the water supply side. I would say another avenue is as we get more of a future look of where we're going to be, building the base for more funding and trying to get some financial support for trying to do more watershed actions to try to come up with the portion of cost share. Like we're trying to come up with our 50% cost share for the water injection demo project with you all. And I would say, cover some of our debt, reduce some of our long-term costs, starting to how do we have this conversation for what is a true funding need? What are we going to need to cover the O&M of aging structures into the future and to maintain them from a sediment and a water quality aspect?
How do you get to that where you can change and where you can meet what you've got to do and still accomplish that with the funding needs that you're going to have?
Well, I think to make these reservoirs, sustainable, I think it's going to take partnering and assistance from, at least 50-50, something or create ways to make, development of plans, a team effort, but and I'm not sure exactly what I was. It's pretty simple. We want to partner with the Corps instead of being more like a customer, be a partner, and both have an interest, both state interest and federal interest in making our infrastructure sustainable. But we are working on our end toward that. We've done a lot of investment in the watershed, but like I said, that's insufficient. It can't control the problem. And as Richard mentioned, we're reaching a point where we might have part of the revenue generation from our water sales might be when we get out of debt to the Corps for our original purchases. We'll maintain that revenue, and the hope is to put that revenue back into reservoir protection and restoration, and I think particularly restoration. But I don't think we have the capacity to do it all, and just want to make that pitch. Federal interest. But you can put a good word in there.
There was talk a few years back about the subject of aquifer replenishment and recharging. Is that from your perspective? Is that a feasible thing? Is it a natural thing? Is it something that can be helped with the help of engineering?
Yeah, artificial recharge and recovery, that is a fantastic idea. That is a huge reservoir that doesn't have any evaporation. And I think I think that may play a role in the future, especially where there are viable aquifers to do that, like along the Kansas River. I think that's a direction we need to explore as much as possible and develop, passive, whatever methods we can enlist to keep that aquifer topped off. And
the Ogallala one?
No, that would be the Kansas River alluvium. So the ones that you can really do recharge are more shallow, unconfined aquifers.
Okay.
The Ogallala High Plains, that much of it is pretty much confined, and it has a recharge rate of something. It's just a fraction of what an alluvial aquifer, for example, might experience.
Yeah, so within Kansas, the city of Wichita is doing aquifer storage and recharge coming when they pull out of the Little Arkansas River, and then so they're recharging that Equus Beds aquifer, but that would be more of a near surface, very shallow aquifer there, which would be different, as Nate is saying, maybe the more western and Ogallala aquifer, where just the time of the recharge travel might be fairly significant just from the study that we have available from the Kansas Geological Survey and U.S. Geological Survey looking at those recharge rates there.
Rich, are you from Kansas originally?
Yep. Yes,
okay.
sir.
And I'm so surprised you said Arkansas and not Arkansas. Like yeah. I was actually not going to say the river's name because
usually go
I didn't
want
to get that.
Usually go with Ark, but yeah, I guess we are in Topeka, so.
No,
shame on you.
Was there something that I should have asked you that I really do appreciate you taking the time, but was to sit down and talk and tell us about what you all do here. But was there something I should have asked you that I didn't ask you that you really wanted to address?
I always like when people want to learn about, the framework we've worked so hard to put together. I think our the way we manage with drought and the framework around built upon the original Appropriation Act, the way you develop water rights. Building upon that, I just like talking about that and how much we're prepared. We have plans in place. Whenever drought happens, we know what to do. It's not a reactive system. It's been very proactive, and then it's actively managed and monitored. There was one question you had in our preliminary stuff. You asked about, who owns the water, and I can't remember.
Yeah, that is actually, I guess I didn't get into that. How does that work? Because it is different in this part of the country than it is where I grew up.
Yeah, so I was going to have Richard cover that. He covered water rights a little bit, but yeah. I just thought maybe that would be good for you to, who owns the water. And
yeah, so I read the statute there earlier because this can be interpreted a little differently depending on who you ask, but generally the succinct way I've heard it talked about is the state still retains, like, quote, ownership of the water, but the water is dedicated for the use of the people of the state. So just because someone has a water right, that doesn't mean they own all the water that's below them. Just because they have a water right doesn't mean they own all the water that's coming down the river in front of them. But what they own is that right to access that water. But within the generalized schema, the state is still the quote quote owner, but it's dedicated for that usage of the people. But that can be kind of a sticky one to work through there. But yeah.
So there's no riparian rights. It's belongs to I've always thought of it as belongs to the people of the state of Kansas, and they can apply and get approved for a beneficial use of that water if they can justify it. And there's two ways to get use of water and get a right to it. And one is the Water Appropriations Act. It's first in time, first in right. And the second is what I mentioned before. The State Water Plan Storage Act established water reservation rights. So there's two kinds of water rights. Water reservation rights are only for storage of water in federal reservoirs controlled by the state. So
about how much do you guys know combined? How many acre feet of storage that you guys basically manage on behalf of the people of the state of Kansas?
That's a number I should have on the top of my head.
It'd be a fun fact there.
I'd say we're getting close to 1 million acre feet. But we have small reservoirs compared to the ones in Oklahoma and on the Missouri River main stem.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I mean, some of our flood pools are big, but yeah, we don't have. In fact, yeah, I'd say in the Tulsa district, we're really storage short. There's a lot more water going through the system than we're able to control. There's times that I've managed through droughts in the Cottonwood, Neosho, and Verdigris that we have months of storage. We don't have years of storage. We went from a full pool at John Redmond in 2012, in June of 2012, to only 30% remaining the beginning of 2013. So months.
To your sleepless night question, that would be where
that's what keeps you up.
If we're in a drought, yes, some of these reservoirs, their drainage basins are fairly small in the grand, comparatively to some of the other reservoirs outside of the state. So yeah, some of our cities that are dependent on these, it's what's the probability of catching a rainfall event within a sometimes less than a county-sized drainage basin? So I would say that would be one of those things that might keep you up at night, especially if you're looking at a very prolonged drought. And as we look into the future with reduced conservation pools, it's just we'd have less time to support those needs through a drought.
So, Mike, I have a question for you.
Sure. Yeah.
What's been your favorite thing we've talked about, or the most interesting?
I think the hydrosuction idea and the notion of how to get that siltation removed is that's extremely interesting. That's definitely an interesting concept, and I mean, the perception of how some of these structures were created. And most people don't know about the water supply connection and how that goes back to reimbursing the federal government for the cost of the structure, the original initial cost of the structure. I really do appreciate you guys' time. I don't want to hold you up because I know we're getting close to the end of the day. But is there anything else that you would like to mention that we really need to look at?
Well, I would maybe just go on Nate made reference, just thankful for our partnership and collaboration, especially with the water management side, just on carrying out, the missions of the reservoirs here. As Nate referenced, it's been good experience and good communication. And I'm just thankful and hopeful we can keep that into the future and look for other ways to collaborate on these reservoir projects.
Outstanding. For Corpstruction. Corpstruction is a production of the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Public Affairs Office. For more information about the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, visit us on the web at www.swt.usace.army.mil. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.
And good communication. I'm just thankful and hopeful we can keep that into the future and look for other ways to collaborate on these reservoir projects.
Outstanding. For Corpstruction. Corpstruction is a production of the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Public Affairs Office. For more information about the Tulsa District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, visit us on the web at www.swt.usace.army.mil. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.